Righty. I do believe we are live. That's wonderful. That's great. Good evening, everybody. It's Dr. Bob. I'm Bob Weathers here at Your Vitality Project with my regular guest and esteemed friend, Angela MacLeod. Happy to be here with you, Angela. Thank you.
Great to be here with you, Bob.
Yeah, thank you. Our Friday night tradition, and I like it a lot. Our topic for tonight's conversation is the summation of not only this week's posts that have been posted on Facebook and YouTube and at our website, but also they represent the summation of several weeks of looking at how we can build a foundation for sustained sobriety. And so tonight's topic is really kind of a summation of everything that we've talked about for the last few weeks. And the title of tonight's conversation is How to Sustain Sobriety Amidst Challenges. Part of what we've looked at this week are identifying what we see as barriers to our sobriety, challenges to our staying on track, and how we might be able to drop down into those and examine them for emotions that arise, feelings in our body that arise when we get aware of these self-perceived challenges. Also to look at requirements that we might place on ourselves around these requirements. I mean, these challenges. We've been talking about negative storylines. So looking at negative storylines, looking at ways that these activate the depressor, which is a term we use for that part of ourselves. Oftentimes it's associated with shame, and also the fixer, which can create temporary relief, but sometimes it creates other problems too. So all of that we've been looking at. And tonight, I just feel like it'd be wonderful to kind of add a punctuation point at the end of this series by sitting with you and talking about managing challenges in sobriety. And I think particularly today's post, as you and I were just talking, it feels like it really brings up how much leverage we have in terms of being able to be with our bodies, be with our emotions, be with our experiences in a way that moves much more towards calmness than towards being emotionally activated or off-center physically. So we've been talking about that under the umbrella of nervous system regulation, which is right in the center of much of your expertise. So I'd like to invite any reflections that you might have, Angela, and just hear from you, and we can talk about it together here.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the nervous system, you know, it's a part of our everyday life, like breathing and the heartbeat, that, you know, we don't have to really pay attention to. It just works. It works on its own. However, we can get into patterns where we can get stuck in a circuit of our nervous system that's really more about survival, fighting, fleeing, freezing, you know, extreme situations. And even though we may not be in situations every day that require that level of response, we can react to everyday things, everyday stressors, and from that place of extreme reaction, whether it's getting really angry or shutting down or being very judgmental, even just critical of ourselves, that these things can be sort of like the dial is turned up on enough that it becomes very unpleasant in our lives. Our lives are kind of running on this unpleasant circuitry.
Yeah.
And without us really even recognizing that. And so that's one of the things that I have found has been just useful to know that, first of all, and then to begin to recognize within my own body and what's going on. What are the signals that let me know that I'm in that fight or flight mode? I'm in the red alert brain, or when I'm more centered in the resting brain, in the calm circuitry. So it's almost like we have these different circuitry. If you think about your house, it's got circuits of electricity in it that, you know, we turn on a light and there's electricity that comes and gets the light to turn on. We don't really think as much about the electrical system. It's behind the walls. But it's like in our body, we have a couple different circuitries that activate in different ways in response to how we perceive our lives and what's going on. So one of the things that I've been really working on a lot for myself, because I've had a long history of being what might be seen as chronically activated, chronically stressed and anxious. So that'd be one circuit where maybe I'm not running down the road to get out of here, but in my body, I feel like that. Or I feel very defensive a lot. And so the other circuitry is more of a shutdown mode where I will feel depressed, or I feel lack of motivation. I can't really contact my feelings. I don't really know what to say in a social situation. So that's another form of being in a more survival mode where we're kind of shut down. Shame is also part of that circuitry. And so just becoming more aware of that, and then starting to learn ways to shift into what we would call red alert, or sorry, the resting brain is the term that you've used a lot here. It can also be seen as the calm circuitry of the nervous system. Yeah. It's the one where we feel comfortable with other people, we feel connected, we feel enjoyment of life, we feel creative, we're connected to our higher brain function, and many other things. And so just becoming aware of that and finding ways to shift into that more calm circuitry in our bodies, it's partly in our bodies as well as our brain, can really affect our recovery. And so, as you've been pointing out, noticing what are the things that are challenges in our lives that cause us to go into the red alert brain or go into that fight or flight mode, that's a big first step. It can be pretty daunting, at least it has been for me, to see how often I can be triggered, how often situations in my life can trigger me. And as I was reflecting on today's post, the question of what is the most challenging to my recovery, or my sobriety. And for me, it's often when several difficult things are happening at once. So it seems like when more than two things is going on that's difficult or challenging, that's a real red flag time for me. And so the wonderful thing is that as you start to get to know what are those things are, what those challenges are, so you might think, well, I'm not going to go to that situation. I'm not going to get into a situation where I'm going to be challenged. But really, you could end up not participating in life very much if you try to control the outside world or just get away from everything. So it really comes down to what can we do inside of ourselves to help build resiliency in the face of the things that are challenging and help shift the nervous system. So I really love your very uncomplicated resource that you continue to bring to us over and over again, the 5-minute mindfulness of the breath. And I love that it's repeated, because that is one of the key things. Whether it's mindfulness of the breath or some other method or technique, one of the key things is building the skill in your life over and over again, even when you're not challenged. So doing these practices, whatever they are, so that it becomes, even if it's not your first reflex, it's easier to remember, it's easier to pull up that resource. So the whole idea of having regular practice, going beyond emergency, first aid, like one of my first aid that I learned actually in 12-step program is the pause. The pause before you react. And I use that a lot before I say something, especially when I can tell that I'm getting triggered, to pause. And so now you're also introducing many more resources, especially mindfulness of the breath. And that allows for the shift in the nervous system to take place. And you don't have to tell your nervous system to do that. It's like you have to give your nervous system the experience. I can breathe, I have breathing room, and you literally do that. Or going on a walk, or hugging your cat or your dog or whatever it is. And I have a couple other things to add to that, but that I think I'll pause there and just see if you want to add anything or comment on any of that.
Mhm. I love all that you're saying. I want to encourage you to continue on. I feel like you've been extremely clear. Let me just summarize one piece for
Sure.
clarification. Is that what we've been talking about here is the red alert brain, that it manifests in different forms. If I understand you, it can manifest in terms of that kind of frenetic anxiety that can drive us. That's very unpleasant. It can also manifest, that same system can manifest in other forms, such as the shutting down, the closing in of depression or shame. But the common denominator is that it's distressful. It's objectively unpleasant. And so whatever form that goes for an individual, some people get very distractible, and it just goes different ways. But that we have a reprieve, and that this other system is always available. It's just opening or rerouting our attention to this other system with skillful means. And you just named a number of those. We've used this old battle axe era, the mindfulness of the breath. I've just done it probably ad nauseum, but it's a goal to make it reflexive. I shared a story yesterday, and then I want to come back to you. We had as a guest yesterday morning Nadja Lindt from Berlin, and we were sharing this story, and you might have seen this, and you and I have talked about it in other contexts. A couple of years ago, when I was asked to speak to a large group of strangers, they happened to all be pharmacists, and which I'd never spoken to a group. It was like 400 pharmacists in a room. I'm up in the front row, and they're getting ready to announce me, and I'm going to speak for a few hours. And it was just a setup for a lot of anxiety for me. And what I'm grateful for is that I just defaulted to breathing. And as I shared yesterday with Nadja, it didn't do away with my anxiety completely. It wasn't like some magic broom that swept it all away. But I'll guarantee you it reduced it by half, so I could get up on stage and then kind of get my bearings. And once I was going, it was relatively fine, but I thought I was going to have a heart attack. I was so nervous. And what I'm struck by is it wasn't like, okay, Bob, what are you going to do? It's like I just started doing the breathing. It was exactly the exercise. And so whatever that is for somebody, if it's going for a walk or hugging a cat or breathing, it's like to have something that's so developed that it becomes second nature. And I'm grateful because that saved my booty that day, and I think that's part of the point. So moving from the distress brain, the red alert brain, to the resting brain, whatever language you use for that, there are skillful means for doing that, and it's available to us if we can reroute our attention, reroute our minds and our bodies, and open up that flow.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more. I know you have more to say about this, so please continue.
And in a way, I also see that there can be more that to be done besides choosing some techniques or some skillful means. And my own example with that is that I practice qigong, a mindful movement practice, and I have other things I do too. And I can spend my half hour or my hour doing these practices, which includes deep breathing, and feel fantastic, feel very grounded and centered. And then within 1 minute, I can walk into the other room, or I can check something on my email, and I can so quickly sometimes get triggered again so easily. It happens. And what that reminds me is that I can still have ways of thinking or beliefs about myself or about life that don't just go away because I'm doing certain techniques or certain practices that help my nervous system calm. Those kind of reflexes in my mind, or maybe it's patterns of how I interact with people, that can kind of put me right back into that red alert brain mode. And so I just say that I kind of have these two categories. One is kind of first aid or emergency measures. So like you were saying, you're sitting in that situation where you're going to go up on stage and speak and you're feeling really anxious. In that moment, you had a tool or a practice that you could do that really worked for you. Didn't completely change the anxiety, but it made it manageable. And that's really fantastic to have those kinds of skills. I also am working with the fact that there are beliefs and core beliefs that I'm not even aware of that I brought to the surface through therapy. or through being in support groups where I do deep inquiry with people, or with whether it's recovery dharma, refuge recovery, or 12 steps where we do inventories or we do deep inquiry, that help to go to some of the deeper, even sometimes unconscious shadow stuff that we're carrying, so that can also help to remove some of those challenges that can put us at risk in our recovery.
I love that you're bringing this up, and I want to jump in if I can to respond really affirmatively. Both Freud and Jung in the early days of psychotherapy talked about transforming the unconscious. And if you think about it this way, there are, like when I'm in front of that group and I apply first aid, I applied the Band-Aid of mindfulness, and it was effective enough to help get me through. That's almost like a surface level intervention. And it's not that it's not useful, it's not that it's not important, but there's a baseline underneath all of that was getting activated for me. I didn't have the luxury of stepping aside and saying, I'll be right back, you guys, I'm going to have a therapy session right now, or something like that. That would have been okay. That would have been okay. But what that activates in terms of psychological organizing principles, which is some combination of our past history, particularly traumatic past history, how that gets stored in terms of our mind, our memory, as well as our reactivity emotionally and even physiologically. All of that stuff is the deeper structure, and that's really what Freud and Jung were talking about. Can we transform that stuff? And I think that therapy, support groups, inquiry, spiritual practices, all of that is to get at this level. So sometimes, and I really appreciate you naming this, it's like a dual process going on. I'm interested in reducing, for me, and in the work that I do over all these years as a therapist and now as a coach, I'm interested in reducing the water table line, the baseline, and that takes deep interior work to get at that, as well as to provide skillful means when I'm having a bad moment, like in front of 400 strangers that are all pharmacists. And they're both important. And I appreciate you naming that, because I think we live in a culture, and I'm going to make a statement here that I'm going to stand by it. I think we live in a culture that focuses on surfaces. We don't live in a culture, I think, that acknowledges that there's a deep structure to each one of us psychologically that radically affects our physical health, radically informs our emotional well-being, our relationships. And if that's not attended to skillfully, you can do all the band-aids you want in the world, but there'll be no end. It's like the whack-a-mole approach to symptoms. I mean, they'll just keep popping up all over. So thank you for kind of stepping back from the canvas and saying, and oh, by the way, there's dealing with the big picture. And that work is ongoing work for any of us that are in the process of healing, whether it be from addictions to substances or addiction to attitudes or behaviors. We want to work at that deep structural transformation, because what that does is it reduces the probability of these other things getting lit. We're humans, and so we'll get activated. But I'd like to reduce my vulnerability to being activated as much as I can in this lifetime. To put it another way, I'd like to increase my ability to be compassionate with others and with myself. And that requires deep level work. I believe very strongly, and I think you do too.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for bringing that perspective in. And I, because I'm very interested in the nervous system and work, and I'm on this sort of at the beginning, it's like there's this, for me, there was almost this drive to always stay in the resting brain, always be in the calm mode. Like I could somehow, figure out a few things to do, and then I would always be in this calm mode. And I've come to see that that's not usually possible, that actually we just continue to get triggered. I don't have the same level of trigger as I used to, the same intensity or the same length of time. But I'm also actually almost coming around to some of the deepest work can happen when I'm in the right kind of, I want to say, container. So if I'm in a group that I really feel trust with the other people, or I'm in a therapeutic situation, or I'm with a facilitator where I feel the safety, and then I go into what is that deep trigger? What is that shameful thing? What is that deeper wound? So that, and I'm sure you can actually explain this better than I can, but I've experienced that when there's that safer container, and then we we allow that pain or that wound or that trigger to
Yeah.
come into that space, that's when the deeper kind of healing can happen. And it usually seems to need to be with somebody.
Yeah.
In my experience, I don't find that as much by myself and in my own experience. So that's a deeper level. Maybe that's more where we find deeper transformation can take place.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate you bringing this in. And of course, I'm right with you with this. If you think about that most of our deepest wounds to our sense of self-esteem, to our sense of selves, that most of those happen in transactions with others, oftentimes in early development, because those early developmental wounds are so formative. It's like, there's a blank tablet, and on that tablet are written these blueprints for the rest of our lives, and they're laid down very early on. And for many of us, not all of us, but for many of us, those things we've experienced distortions in the creation of that blueprint. And so it stands to reason what you're saying, as far as I can see, Angela, and you know that I'm a believer in this, is that if the wounds happen in the context of relationship, how could the healing happen completely in isolation? It doesn't make sense to me. And if I just talk about it pragmatically, there's so much more traction in relationship for the healing to happen, because we're wired evolutionarily to connect. And so you've got so much, you've got the whole history of the human species in an interaction. And so if that can be handled, this is the big if, and you just named it so beautifully. If that can be created where there's a safe, a very safe container with very thick walls, so that there's boundaries around that and so on, is that if we can risk going back into the places where we feel like we've been wounded, the places, as Pema Chodron, the Tibetan Buddhist nun, says, the places that scare us, if we can risk doing that, and who of us can risk doing that unless there's all kinds of safety? That's the definition of a therapeutic encounter. That therapeutic encounter might happen with a friend or a minister or a relative or a therapist. It's just whenever that happens, those are the facilitative conditions for therapy. I don't know any more powerful matrix for transformation than going back into the place of the vulnerability, like what you're saying. You talk about, being with shame or fear or any or anger, any other strong emotion, and being in the presence of somebody who's loving and skillful. We can actually reorganize some of those templates, some of those connections, and done repeatedly, kind of like with meditation, done repeatedly, you can absolutely transform the blueprint. You can actually change that. The technical term for this in psychotherapy is referred to as earned security.
Oh, yeah.
We can actually earn security where we were previously insecure. Maybe we avoided connection because we were wounded, or maybe we chased down connection just kind of without any differentiation because we were desperate. What would it be like to actually earn a new way of being in relationship, that we can actually be comfortable inside our skin, being connected with others, as well as being alone? And I think that therapy, and I'm thinking of therapy in its broadest sense, therapy is such a powerful tool for that. So it's what you're committed to. It's what I've been committed to my entire career. It's right at the heart, in my view, of addiction recovery. When Johann Hari says the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. Better believe that he's right about that. It's about connection. But it's not just any connection. It's the kind of connection that you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe a final comment or two, and then we'll wind up for today with more to follow.
Just that combination is really powerful, that we do our own work. Like, there's work to do on myself by myself. I'm with me all day long. So I need to to take, to be aware as I go, to use the 5-minute breathing meditation, to do the timeout, to journaling or whatever. But in combination with work with skillful people, with groups that you feel comfortable with, that's going to really exponentially change things and make our recovery vital.
I'll just put this as a postscript, is that the research is in, and it's very clear, is that those that are able to sustain sobriety long term, and that's our topic tonight, they're the ones that access group support. It's not only that, But
Yeah.
just adding that to the equation, it ends up, it shows up on the back end, which is it extends sobriety. And you can look at it, it's what we call a direct linear positive correlation. The more support you have with others, the more you can count on sustained sobriety. So there's the math. And so we've been talking about kind of the psychology and even the spirituality of it, or the physiology of it as well. But it really is borne out in the research. It's undeniable. So yeah, a big fat yes to connection as being the opposite of addiction. That's for sure. Yeah. Angela, as always, I love connecting with you. Yeah, thank you so much for being here tonight. Yeah. Really appreciate it. It's a treasure. It's a treasure.
Yeah. I feel that way too.
Thank you. Thank you. I wish you a good evening, a good weekend to you. To all of our listeners, thank you all for joining us. Angela and I'll be back next Friday, so come see us, okay? Thank you, dear. Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye.